So sustainability is at its core about meeting people's needs today and in the future, and there's no need more basic than food. Over the centuries, our species has gotten really good at producing food. In many ways, we're way more sustainable than we ever were, but we still fall short on a couple of key measures. One is simply that we don't fully meet people's needs today. We know 1 in 8 people around the world are undernourished, and many more than that don't have enough nutritious food to lead a healthy life. But second, we know that we're undermining much of the environment that we need to support the systems that produce food. This is a picture of soybean coming into rainforest in the tropics, and this is a very common picture still around the world. Agriculture is a major driver of habitat loss, a major driver of groundwater depletion, eutrophication, and it is one of the major drivers of arguably the biggest challenge of our times, which is climate change. I wanted to underscore this a little bit for this crowd. So many of you may be familiar with a figure like this from the IPCC, which is showing the emissions of greenhouse gases over time and the trajectories that we need to be on to meet certain climate targets, whether it's, say, a 2-degree target or a 1.5-degree target. We know that in order to keep climate stable at those levels, we need to get emissions to zero sometime late in the century. And net zero includes some sources of negative emissions. Now, food systems right now are accounting for 25 to 30% of greenhouse gas emissions globally. And one thing that's not fully appreciated is that in these scenarios, these modeling scenarios that get us to stable climate, they're typically assuming not only do food systems and land use get to zero emissions, they get actually quite negative. Many of them are down here about 10 to 15 gigatons of net uptake in the land system. Now, personally, I'm quite flattered that they think that the people working on food are so much smarter than the people working on energy and other things that we can get negative so much sooner. But it just really underscores the amount that we're asking of these land systems looking forward. It's not just to produce food, it's to do all sorts of things for the environment. And it's become quite popular in the world of agriculture to talk about these challenges in the context of what's called climate-smart agriculture, which is really about 3 pillars. One is to raise productivity, and that's to feed people, to generate incomes, but also to save land for those other needs in the environment. The other is to raise resilience, and this is recognizing the tremendous threats that climate change poses to the way that we grow food around the world. And then third is to reduce the emissions and increase the uptake of carbon into working lands. And so these 3 pillars are sort of the foundation of what we need food systems to do going forward. Now, what does that actually mean? What does climate-smart agriculture actually look like? The truth is we don't know because we haven't really done it. But when you look at what people are talking about when they talk about climate-smart agriculture, it's largely these 6 things. There's a few more, but they wouldn't fit on the slide. You have things like zero tillage, meaning in contrast to the traditional practice of tilling the soil in preparation for each season, you leave it be and you drill the seeds in. And that helps to preserve the soil in place, reduce erosion, but also build up carbon, maybe deal more with drought stress, et cetera. Cover cropping is something where in the off-season you're sowing a crop to remain on the land, to keep the nitrogen in place, to build up carbon. This is actually probably the #1 subsidized practice right now. The US is spending hundreds of millions of dollars to try to get farmers to do this more. Early sowing is a really important thing in many systems where trying to get this crop in early can be really helpful, both from a productivity and resilience standpoint. Crop diversification means both within a field, but especially over time. Having a diversity of crops can help improve productivity potentially. It could help deal with stresses. It could help build up soil carbon. Agroforestry is what it sounds like, planting trees in agricultural landscapes. And you might imagine those can be helpful for dealing with climate stresses. They can certainly be helpful for building up soil carbon. And then all sorts of precision management, particularly precision fertilization techniques, can be really effective at building up, increasing productivity of lands and also making them less polluting in terms of nitrogen pollution. So these are actually things that my group works on in different degrees. and some other things as well. But the main point here is that these are all proposed as things that should work. We know almost certainly that they don't work everywhere. And we're trying to learn about exactly when and where they're effective and how effective they really are. The way we typically have tried to study these things as a community is through experimentations like this, where this is really the origin of statistics in many ways, very old, doing randomized experiments, split pot designs on these systems. But as you can imagine, it's very difficult to run these over long time periods. And it's also, even if you get a very solid result for one location, it's very difficult to extrapolate those to other places with different soils and different climates. So the external validity of these approaches are often very problematic. And the way traditionally that was approached is you just do a lot of them, maybe hundreds of them if you're lucky, and wait for a long time. My group is focused on a different approach. And that is to use observations rather than experiments to understand the effectiveness of different practices, or in other contexts, the effects of different changes going on in the system. This is just one example of a constellation that NASA puts up of satellites that are orbiting the Earth and continuously taking observations of the land surface. I don't know how well it's showing up on this screen, but on the right is showing images collected, for example, over a farm in the US and over a farm in Kenya, just to demonstrate that we can now basically monitor every field on the Earth in a very routine basis. There's all sorts of satellites not shown here that are run by the Europeans and run by private companies as well. Even this is not shown here anymore. So from these, we can start to put together a picture of the landscape. This is an example in the US, showing you for the Corn Belt of the US, for every single piece of land, every single, in this case, 30-meter pixel, what crop is being grown, in this case in 2020. We grow a lot of corn and soybean here, so it's not a terribly interesting map, but there's other things in there as well. We can then, for example, if you're interested in soybean, we can then go in and just look at the soybean fields. And my group and others have developed all sorts of techniques to start describing these soybean fields in great detail. So this is an example of soybean productivity, a measure of yield in this particular year for the soybean fields that we can detect just by watching the crop grow from space. And we've done a whole bunch of validation with ground data. These methods are working quite well. We can do things like map practices. So this is an example of which farmers are tilling versus not tilling in the US. It's a widely adopted practice, but it's not anywhere universal. Depending on where you are in the country, you have a mix of both. We can look at things like rotation. In the US, it happens that most farmers do rotate. Usually it's a simple corn-soy rotation. Some farmers, though, do not. And particularly for other crops like corn, they tend to grow multiple years in a row. We can now look at things like cover cropping. I mentioned cover cropping is really being pushed. And in fact, now in Indiana, for example, where this example is, upwards of 10% of farmers are practicing it, but it's still by no means the majority. So the idea is we can combine these things together, we can track them over time, and now we can learn from these observations what we would hope to learn from experiments, which is how effective are they overall, but how effective are they dealing with drought, how effective are they dealing with other types of stressors. We do this through using a bunch of different methods that have been developed by others, both at Stanford and throughout the world. But there's been a real revolution, not only in the data available, but the amount of methods available to do causal inference. Difference in difference, synthetic control, causal force, these are, some of you use these in your research. These are the types of things that really provide a really powerful method to make strong inferences from observations alone. Increasingly, we're able to do this. I showed you examples of the US, but we're able to do this around the world, including in smallholder systems that we really have not historically even had good experiments in. This is showing you on the example of crop rotation. My group is now looking at this question in a bunch of different continents. And I'll just point out here that unlike the US, where we have a lot of rotation, and Canada as well, you can see in Europe and China, rotation is much less common. They're tending to grow the same crop year after year. So now, throughout the world, we have over 500 million farmers. Each year, they are running, in some ways, their own natural experiment. The idea is to learn quickly from all of these activities. So I'm going to show you some examples of work. I wanted to acknowledge the group that does this. Historically, we've just referred to ourselves with the very creative name of the Lobell Lab. But I thought for today, I would come up with a more descriptive term. And we do things I'm not talking about today. But the first thing that came to mind was better agronomy decisions at scale for sustainability. So I'm introducing today the Badass group. And I'll talk about two specific examples. One is on the cover cropping. As I mentioned, it's a policy focus, not just in the US, but around the world. Carbon markets are also very much into cover cropping right now. And then I'll talk about diversification, which I think is interesting for reasons I'll talk about. So what we've done with cover cropping in the US is we've tracked it as it's come online. And then we've looked at fields both before and after it came and compared those to fields that never adopted it, but were otherwise very similar. So you can see, for example, in the pre-adoption period, where before any cover cropping was done, just taking a decadal average here, the fields were fairly similar. Maybe the farmers who tended to adopt what we're calling here the treated fields maybe were a little bit less productive. And this is something you'll hear a lot, is that farmers will tend to put cover crops into their more marginal fields to experiment. But what you see is over time, they diverge. In other words, the treated fields actually lag quite a bit behind the progress being made overall. And if you add that up, it's basically a 5% yield loss. Now, this is a significant number in the world of agriculture. It may not seem like a big number, but because yield shocks or productivity shocks in general translate to supply shocks that translate to price changes, which then drive incentives to clear, we've shown in other work that a 5% yield shock in the US can cause enough clearing in other countries to basically offset 3/4 of the soil carbon benefits of cover crops. So it gives you a sense of how 5% actually is quite insignificant. And from a farmer's perspective, 5% can be the difference between a profitable year and a non-profitable year. So this is a concern. Now we're hoping that over the long term, as these methods, as farmers get better at implementing and as the soil benefits accrue, that maybe these will dissipate, or maybe we can learn about specific ways to implement it. For example, they're usually growing ryegrass, which is the cover crop shown in this picture, but there are other options out there that are potentially less damaging to productivity. The second example is on crop diversification and rotation, and this is showing some recent results from around the world. So each color here is showing you a different country, and each panel is showing you a different crop. So the way to read this is that for each point, it's a specific rotation, like soy to corn, for example, in the US. And it's showing you what the effect is of rotating relative to not rotating. So anything above this zero line is showing you a benefit. And in fact, we see benefits almost all across the board. We see really large benefits in spring wheat. These are actually things like kidney beans. This point here happens to be kidney beans grown before spring wheat, which is not super common, but it's pretty common. Provides a big boost to the subsequent wheat crop. We also see some odd things like soybean before winter wheat having a damaging effect. This was something that some experiments had hinted at and seems to be related to the water balance of the system, but we're still trying to figure that out. So the good news here is that rotation does seem quite effective. It also seems quite effective, or especially effective in wet conditions, which for those places getting wetter with climate change offers some adaptation possibility. At the same time, we can look, and this is hard to do in experiments, but we can look at more complicated rotations, 3 years, 4 year sequences, and we can see how effective those are. In general, we find that those really cluster around zero. They're not providing that much additional benefit. But in wheat, again, we do see some signs that actually even a third crop into the rotation would be beneficial. And again, we can see the effects are sometimes even bigger in climate stressful conditions, which would suggest that improving rotations and encouraging rotations may, in some situations, help deal with the stresses of climate. Yep. So I think I'm at time, 1 minute. So I'm going to end there. I just wanted to underscore again that it may seem odd to think of as agronomy as the solution for our environmental challenges, but when you get out in the world and you look at what farmers are doing, you understand that there's so much uncertainty that any individual farmer faces, and there's a very high chance that they are really practicing suboptimal practices because it's extremely difficult to get the optimum right. The idea here is we can learn from the collective experience of 500 million or tens of millions if you're looking within a country, and we can achieve that sort of sustainability target much more quickly. Thank you.